War is remembered in flashes, Spitfires slicing clouds, tanks hammering forward, speeches echoing over static radios. Yet victory often arrived on 4 muddy wheels and a bad clutch. The Fordson WOT wasn't glamorous. It groaned, leaked, and rattled its way from Normandy to Berlin, less a vehicle and more a stubborn idea with headlights. When others bogged down, it trudged on. When bridges collapsed, it found another way. If Britain had a mechanical stiff upper lip, this was it, painted in olive drab and doing its best impression of a wheezing bulldog. By the late 1930s, Britain was an island preparing for a land war. Its armies were well drilled, its industry vast, and its supply network, frankly, a mess. Trucks were civilian hand-me-downs, fragile, inconsistent, and allergic to mud. In an age that demanded mobility, Britain had the mechanical equivalent of a limp. The War Office knew that without reliable transport, even the best tank divisions would grind to a halt. Troops could march, supplies could not. Ammunition, fuel, rations and field guns all relied on a vehicle fleet that could cross Europe's wreckage and still start again in the morning. Ford's British division in Dagenham offered a solution. Their civilian Fordson trucks were dependable and cheap, built with a kind of rural honesty that appealed to military planners. The War Office Truck Programme, WOT for short, was born. It would yield an entire family of vehicles, each adapted for a specific role, from the small 1,500-weight WW2 to the larger 6x4 artillery haulers. The Fordson was never designed to impress. It was designed to work. The army needed something light enough to lift by hand, rugged enough to cross a ploughed field, and simple enough for a half-trained driver to repair with a hammer and a prayer. In other words, the opposite of most British engineering at the time. In 1939, as mobilisation began, Dagenham's production lines changed overnight. Chrome bumpers disappeared. Khaki paint arrived by the barrel. Ford engineers stripped down their civilian models. No frills, no fuss, just bare function. Steel replaced polish, and every nut that didn't matter was deleted. If it didn't help win a war, it didn't get a bolt. The early WO2s were soon shipped to training grounds, pulling light artillery or ferrying kit through mud deep enough to drown optimism. Soldiers quickly learned its quirks. The engine's stubborn low-end pull, the high cab, the spindly wheels that looked like they'd borrowed tyres from a pram. But it worked. It always worked. Britain's supply doctrine began to shift. Mobility was no longer a luxury. It was survival. A truck that could drive through shellfire, haul a generator, or evacuate the wounded mattered as much as any tank. The Fordson was, in its way, an unarmed weapon. It was also a cultural shock. British soldiers expected unreliability. They'd grown up with it. Here came a machine that started first time. One driver recalled that he spent the first week waiting for something to fall off. Nothing did. By the time France fell, the Fordson had proved its worth. Convoys of WOT trucks became a common sight along Britain's coastal defences, lined up nose to tail like patient workhorses waiting for orders. From Dagenham to Dover, the message was clear. Britain might be short on tanks, but it would never again be short on transport. The humble truck had become strategic. The nation's road to survival now ran on Ford pistons, and the miracle was that they didn't demand T-brakes. If necessity was the mother of invention, then Britain in 1940 was a very stern parent indeed. The evacuation at Dunkirk had left the army stripped bare of transport. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned on French beaches. Every lorry, van and staff car left to rust in the surf. The War Office didn't just need trucks, It needed an entire mechanical bloodstream rebuilt from scratch. The vision behind the Fordson WOT program was brutally simple: standardize everything. Up to that point, British logistics had been a circus of incompatible parts. Austin bolts didn't fit Morris engines. Bedford tyres couldn't be swapped with Fords. The result was chaos. A motor pool looked less like an army depot and more like a scrapyard in denial. Ford's engineers in Dagenham approached it differently. They saw war as an engineering system, not a patriotic drama. What mattered was interchangeability: engines, axles, and gearboxes that could be swapped like playing cards. The idea was to create a modular truck family that could share parts across several models. In modern terms, it was the Lego set of military logistics. The WW2, the smallest of the family, became the workhorse. Its 30-horsepower side valve engine wasn't fast, but it was indestructible. Simplicity was its genius. It ran on low-octane fuel, started in the cold, and could be serviced by a man with more enthusiasm than training. If it had feelings, it would have rolled its eyes and got on with it. Ford's management understood something else. Reliability didn't just save time, it saved lives. Every minute a lorry spent broken down was another minute a soldier went hungry or unarmed. So they built the WOT with forgiveness in mind. The suspension was overbuilt, the body plain and accessible, and the cab laid out for quick repair. A man could remove its gearbox in under an hour. The Army tested prototypes on every terrain Britain could throw at them: sand, bog, frost and gravel. They discovered that the little Fordson could climb gradients other trucks balked at. Its short wheelbase and rear-wheel drive made it surprisingly agile, even if its high centre of gravity made every corner feel like a dare. In a world of rigid hierarchy and ceremony, the Fordson's success came from pragmatism. It was the mechanical embodiment of Britain's wartime mindset: functional, underpowered, and profoundly unwilling to give up. Like a tea kettle on wheels, it boiled under pressure and just kept whistling. By 1941, the WOT design philosophy had spread beyond Dagenham. Other factories in Manchester, Southampton and Cork began turning out parts under licence. The vision had become doctrine: build simple, build many, and keep them moving. This wasn't just engineering, it was national psychology made metal, a belief that quantity, simplicity and grit could overcome anything, even a war of machines. The Fordson wasn't heroic in the cinematic sense, but it represented something deeper: competence, quiet, uncomplaining, and utterly British. By the time America entered the war, Britain already had its answer to the logistical nightmare: a family of trucks born not from luxury or pride, but from necessity and tea-stained blueprints. And it turned out that stubborn practicality could be a kind of brilliance. At Ford's Dagenham plant, the smell of oil and ambition thickened the air. Assembly lines once devoted to tractors now turned out military lifelines. Every rivet and piston carried the urgency of a nation hanging by a thread. The WOT program was a logistical ballet: parts arriving from subcontractors across Britain, engines cast in Essex, gearboxes milled in Manchester, and bodies hammered together in tin-roofed workshops where condensation fell like rain. It was industry in overdrive, Britain's quiet miracle of coordination before computers, spreadsheets, or sleep. Each Fordson WOT began life as a pile of steel pressed into shape by the same machines that once built delivery vans. Workers, many of them women, learned to weld, rivet, and fit tyres the size of wardrobes. The rhythm of the plant became the pulse of the war effort, and when a gearbox jammed, the fix was usually a bigger hammer. The Dagenham factory had its quirks. Because of wartime blackout rules, production ran under dim lights and stricter silence. Test engines were fired up only at set hours to avoid attracting attention. The result was eerie. Thousands of trucks being born in semi-darkness, their forms ghosting through the smoke. The trucks themselves evolved quickly. The WOT2 became the lightweight general service vehicle. The WOT3, a 30 CW medium-duty version, the WOT6 and WOT8, bigger 6x4 variants for heavy loads and artillery towing. Ford was now producing an entire ladder of mobility, each rung tailored for a specific weight and purpose. But it was the WOT2, short, boxy and remarkably cheerful looking, that stole the show. Its chassis was simple, rear-wheel drive, semi-elliptic leaf springs, and a 3.6-litre V8 engine derived from civilian Ford cars. It produced only 30 horsepower, but every one of them turned up for work. It was the kind of engine that sounded offended by the concept of rest. On the floor, workers could strip and rebuild one in less than half a day. The cab was crude, wooden floorboards, canvas doors, and a windscreen that folded down when visibility outweighed comfort. Everything about it said temporary, yet thousands survived the entire war. The Ministry of Supply demanded output over aesthetics. Paint was applied in thin, uneven coats. Body panels were never polished. Efficiency ruled. A truck rolled off the line roughly every 40 minutes. To keep up with demand, Ford even converted nearby buildings into assembly extensions. One former laundry became a gearbox line. By 1943, production peaked. Over 130,000 WOT trucks of all variants were on the road. They hauled munitions, carried troops, towed radar, and even served as mobile winches for barrage balloons. From the sands of El Alamein to the forests of Normandy, the sound of their V8s became a kind of industrial heartbeat. Soldiers joked that if you couldn't see a Fordson, you could at least hear one complaining about the terrain. The trucks left Dagenham in convoys that never slept. Their drivers were ordinary men and women, trained overnight and shipped to the front with a manual, a wrench, and optimism. In their wake, Britain's war machine finally found its rhythm, dependable, mechanical, and just loud enough to remind the enemy that supply never stopped. The desert was the Fordson's final exam. In North Africa, temperatures fried radiators before breakfast, and sand turned gearboxes into maracas. Many a truck arrived at dawn looking confident, and by noon looked like it wanted to go home. The Fordson WOT2, designed for Britain's drizzle, now faced the Sahara's furnace. Engineers had fitted larger filters and reinforced radiators, but even so, every mile was a negotiation. Soldiers learned that fine sand could find its way through anything. The trick was constant maintenance. Filters cleaned hourly, oil changed daily, patience renewed hourly. You could almost hear the trucks sigh before each dune. Convoys stretched across the desert like iron centipedes. The WOT carried ammunition, water, and the endless paraphernalia of war. When heavier lorries bogged down, the smaller Fordsons wriggled free. They were the couriers of continuity. Never fast, never elegant, but always there. In the field, reliability wasn't a statistic, it was survival. Drivers slept in their cabs, engines idling at night to keep sand out of the intakes. Mechanics built makeshift workshops from tarpaulins and optimism. Some crews joked that the desert had a personality, spiteful, sarcastic, and slightly impressed that the Fordson kept showing up. Back in Britain, the War Office watched closely. Reports from the 8th Army confirmed the trucks were holding out better than expected. Their V8 engines, originally built for temperate climates, seemed to thrive on adversity. Like most British machinery, they performed best when utterly miserable. Testing continued on other fronts. In Italy, the WOT2's short wheelbase made it invaluable on narrow mountain roads. In Normandy, it was pressed into service as a makeshift ambulance, a radio truck, and even a water carrier. There was no task too small or too absurd. If it had wheels, Someone would find a way to bolt something to it. The real trial, however, wasn't terrain, but time. By 1944, most trucks had been in service for years with minimal overhaul. Paint blistered, seats tore, gear levers loosened. Yet they kept running. Soldiers developed a quiet superstition: never speak well of your WOT out loud, or it would immediately break down to remind you who was in charge. One officer wrote that the Fordson ran as long as we did. That wasn't praise. It was a statement of solidarity. Both truck and crew endured the same exhaustion, both patched up and sent back out. The War Office's gamble had paid off. The Fordson wasn't glamorous, but it had passed every trial the war could invent. It hauled guns through Tunisia, medical supplies through Salerno, and rations through Normandy's hedgerows. It proved that engineering honesty, not power, not style, was the true test of war readiness. And when victory began to look possible, a few Fordsons were already being painted over for peacetime use. The soldiers laughed. The war wasn't over yet, but the trucks had already decided to retire on their own terms. Every war machine faces its reckoning. For the Fordson WOT, it came not in defeat, but in demand. Success became its heaviest burden. By mid-1943, the British Army wanted the impossible: more trucks, more variants, more parts, and all immediately. The WOT program had outgrown itself. Production lines strained under shortages of rubber, steel, and time. Yet Dagenham kept churning them out with the determination of a factory that hadn't noticed there was a limit. The breakthrough was standardization. By designing interchangeable parts across the WOT family, Ford had created something close to modular warfare. Engines, clutches, axles, all could be swapped without paperwork. It was as if Britain had accidentally invented IKEA, only with fewer instructions and more explosions. This efficiency allowed the WOT to adapt. As the war expanded, the same chassis was fitted for radio trucks, water tenders, and even anti-aircraft gun platforms. The RAF used WOTs as balloon winches, the Army as field ambulances, and the Royal Navy, never wanting to be left out, as dockyard haulers. But the more versatile the design became, the thinner its resources stretched. Mechanics in Sicily reported running vehicles built from three others: one man's door, another's gearbox, someone else's patience. Spare parts were often replaced with improvisation. A Fordson was like a ship of Theseus held together by swearing. The miracle was that it still worked. Even when pushed past design limits, the WOT rarely failed catastrophically. If a gearbox died, it limped on. If a tyre blew, it soldiered forward on the rim. Its simplicity was its armour. The Army appreciated that reliability. In a world of delicate tanks and over-engineered monsters, the WOT felt refreshingly mortal. It broke in understandable ways. A snapped spring meant a jolt, not a funeral. It gave soldiers something they rarely had: control over their own fate. That reliability became strategic. During the Italian campaign, WOTs formed the backbone of Allied supply convoys. They ferried everything from petrol drums to pasta tins over bombed roads and fragile bridges. Their short wheelbase made them agile, and their moderate weight meant they could cross ground that sank heavier vehicles. One driver joked that his Fordson could smell a shortcut, though usually through a minefield. It wasn't fast, at best 45 miles per hour on a good day downhill, but it was constant. And in war, constancy is rarer than courage. By the time of the D-Day build-up, the WOT had transcended its humble origins. It was no longer just a truck, it was a logistics philosophy on tyres. Ford's assembly lines, now coordinated across Britain, were producing thousands monthly. The truck had become a symbol of unshowy competence, the quiet miracle that underpinned every grand victory speech. The failure, if any, lay in its legacy. After 1945, as peace returned, the Fordson WOT was quickly forgotten. Too ordinary, too common, too dependable to be romantic. But on the battlefields of Europe, its simplicity had achieved what brilliance often couldn't: consistency. It wasn't the hero of the story, it was the reason the heroes arrived on time. Every success in war leaves a shadow, the unseen cost of triumph. For the Fordson WOT, that shadow was industrial exhaustion. Britain's factories had pushed themselves to the limit. By 1944, the same machinery that produced the WOT had been running almost without pause for 5 years. The people behind the trucks, welders, fitters and riveters, had become soldiers in all but uniform. Their battleground was the production floor, and their enemy was fatigue. The simplicity that made the WOT so repairable on the front lines had a price at home. Civilian industry was neglected, innovation postponed. Dagenham's peacetime research teams vanished into military contracts. The country was building a future it couldn't yet afford to live in. And then there was the human consequence. Tens of thousands of Fordson trucks were sent abroad, many never to return. Those that did came back, scarred, dented and rusted. Their mileage counted in campaigns rather than miles. They were auctioned off, rebuilt, or left to rot in fields. Britain's victory fleet became its scrapyard inheritance. Still, the trucks had changed the nation's understanding of engineering. The war had proved that function could outlast fashion. The lesson was absorbed across industry. Standard parts, modular systems, and ease of repair became the new creed. It was a quiet revolution, born in grease and necessity. There were moral consequences too. The very efficiency that kept Britain alive had shown the world how powerfully industry could serve destruction. The Fordson's reliability was admirable until you remembered what it had enabled. A machine's virtue, it seemed, depended entirely on who gave it orders. In the Middle East, surplus WOTs were sold to local armies and civilian hauliers. They carried grain, water, refugees, whatever the next crisis demanded. A few even saw service in post-war conflicts, still wearing their wartime dents like medals. At home, returning soldiers bought ex-army WOTs to start small businesses, builders, hauliers, electricians. The war truck became a tradesman's friend, hauling bricks instead of shells. Yet for many veterans, the sight of those boxy silhouettes on civilian roads stirred an uneasy nostalgia. The sound of the V8 was the sound of survival and the echo of everything they'd lost. Economically, the truck had left Britain both stronger and poorer, its industries disciplined, but its people drained. The effort to mass-produce utility had created a new kind of national identity, the engineer as patriot, the assembly line as front line. And when peace finally arrived, the silence in the factories was almost unnerving. Ford's production lines slowed, the blackout curtains came down, and the soot-stained walls revealed slogans no one had read in years. Keep them moving. The war was over, but the ethos remained. In the age of peace, the same relentless efficiency that once built weapons would now rebuild lives. The Fordson WOT, born from crisis, had unknowingly reshaped Britain's relationship with industry, proof that even a humble truck could alter a nation's destiny long after the guns had gone quiet. When the guns fell silent, the Fordson WOT rolled on, unbothered, unchanged, and largely uncelebrated. It had been built to serve, not to shine, yet its story didn't end with the armistice. It simply swapped uniforms. Across Britain, demobilised vehicles flooded the civilian market. Auctions were held in old hangars, where farmers and hauliers bid for the same trucks that once carried rations to the front. A WOT2 could be bought for a few pounds, an absolute bargain if you didn't mind that it smelled faintly of petrol, canvas and North Africa. It was the first time in history you could buy victory by the ton. thousands of surplus Fordsons found second lives in construction, forestry, and public works. Converted to tippers, fire engines, or recovery wagons, they became the backbone of post-war rebuilding. Their rugged frames shrugged off new duties, just as they had once shrugged off shrapnel. Collectors today speak of the WOT with quiet affection. Its angular bodywork and upright stance look oddly dignified now, like an old sergeant in a clean uniform. Museums across Britain and Europe keep restored examples, painted, polished, and motionless, a far cry from their muddy youth. At shows, the distinctive burble of the Ford Flathead Viv 8 still turns heads. It's the sound of reliability clearing its throat. The design principles behind the WOT endured. The idea that a vehicle could be simple, modular, and easily serviced became central to post-war automotive engineering. Civilian Fords and Bedfords borrowed its lessons: fewer parts, faster maintenance, standard tools. And in an ironic twist, the Fordson's global wanderings outlasted the empire that built it. From Africa to Asia, surplus WOTs kept working into the 1950s and even 1960s. In remote airfields, old WOT-3s served as fuel bowsers and tugs for the Royal Air Force. Their paint faded, their bolts loosened, but the trucks themselves refused to stop. It was as if they'd never been told the war was over. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the WOT isn't mechanical at all. It's philosophical. The truck represented the triumph of adequacy, the idea that doing the job reliably, without fuss or spectacle, could be a greater virtue than brilliance. It was honest engineering, the kind that never made headlines because it never needed rescuing. Today, surviving WOTs appear at rallies, restored with obsessive care by enthusiasts who see in them a symbol of Britain's practical resilience. Each restoration is an act of remembrance, not for the battles, but for the labour, the sweat, and the ingenuity that kept armies moving. The Fordson WOT didn't change history by being exceptional. It changed it by being enough power, enough strength, enough faith in the ordinary. And in that quiet adequacy lies a kind of greatness no tank or fighter could ever claim. It won its war not with speed or firepower, but with persistence, the most British victory of all. In the decades since its last convoy, the Fordson WOT has become more than a truck. It is a memory cast in metal, a reminder that wars are not only won by brilliance, but by endurance. At air shows and vintage rallies, you sometimes see one standing beside Spitfires and Shermans, its khaki paint sun-faded, its tyres quietly proud. Children climb into the cab, marvel at the wooden floorboards, and ask where the buttons are. The answer is simple. There weren't any. Just a key, a lever, and faith in friction. The Fordson never pretended to be complicated, which is precisely why it mattered. If you trace Britain's post-war character, its mix of resilience, modesty, and mild exasperation, you'll find some of it was learned behind the wheel of a WOT. It taught its drivers that progress is often noisy, uncomfortable, and slightly uphill. It also taught them that when things break, you don't wait for permission. You fix them. That philosophy lived on long after the machines rusted away. It became part of British engineering culture, the quiet belief that practical competence, done properly, is its own form of genius. No medals required. In a sense, the Fordson was a portrait of its builders, ordinary people doing extraordinary work, and doing it well enough that no one noticed at the time. The ultimate compliment to a machine is that it never makes the news. Today, restored WOTs roll through parades to the applause of people who weren't alive when they were first built. The applause isn't just for the truck, it's for what it represents. The victory of persistence over panic, of work over wonder. When you look at its stubby bonnet and blunt nose, it's easy to underestimate it, but then you remember This unassuming vehicle once bridged continents, supplied armies, and helped hold civilization together by sheer repetition. That's not poetry, that's logistics, which in war is close enough. The Fordson WOT was never glamorous, but it didn't need to be. It was a tool of survival, the kind of machine that carried the war's weight without ever asking to be remembered. It just kept going, and perhaps that's the truest reflection of Britain itself during those years. Steady, stubborn, a little worn at the edges, but somehow still moving forward. It was, in the end, the perfect British paradox, ordinary enough to be forgotten, extraordinary enough to deserve remembering.